Good evening. So I'm recording a brief after-action analysis of a conversation I had with a YouTuber called King Crocoduck. Now, most people who are familiar with my channel might be surprised to see this. The conversation I was having with King Crocoduck was a very casual conversation, a discussion. I very rarely do after-action analyses of conversations. I usually save that kind of analysis for a debate, something more contentious. And my conversation with King Crocoduck was certainly on the more friendly side. Nonetheless, I'm noticing that as I read through the comments and listen to the conversation again, I realized that the conversation wasn't quite up to snuff. I was very hurried. I interrupted King Crocoduck a lot. I acted much more aggressively than I would have a typical guest. And so I feel that a sort of re-examination of the issues, a restatement of my ideas would be helpful. I think it would be useful for going forward and analyzing the thoughts if I decide to have another conversation with King Crocoduck in the future. But first, probably an explanation is in order. Now, indeed, listening back to the conversation, I was very aggressive, and part of this was just due to the fact that the conversation was in a very limited time frame. Of course, this is the Christmas season. I have a free hour here, a free hour there. You're kind of fitting this in between other events, other commitments. The regularity of your schedule is disrupted, and I just didn't have the time to let the conversation go on for the full 2 hours that I probably should have reserved for having the conversation to begin with. And of course, I had a lot of material to discuss. I wanted things to move along at a reasonably good clip, and I got impatient and probably acted more aggressively in driving forward the subjects than I really should have. On another more personal note, though, I think one of the main reasons there was sort of this aggressive feeling from my side was I sort of simultaneously had a very large respect for the person of King Crocoduck, but I had very little respect for the opinion he was bringing across. And people might think this is paradoxical, right? I mean, how could you have this high respect for the person and low respect for the person's opinion, given that pretty much all you know about this person, since you're just talking to an anonymous YouTube character, is his opinion? And that really comes down to the fact that in a lot of ways, the opinion I was hearing from King Crocoduck was very familiar to me, because it was as close as I've ever seen my opinion pre-Red Pill, my opinion of 7 years ago. I felt like I knew everything King Crocoduck was about to say because I myself had thought it before. My frustration really wasn't a frustration at stupidity, but just an impatience, a feeling that I'd seen this before and I'd overcome it, and I wanted to help him and his fans overcome it as soon as possible. That sounds incredibly condescending. Perhaps his opinion is the right one, and in turning away from that opinion, I've turned my back on some very important knowledge. Still, nevertheless, when you come across somebody that very ardently embraces an opinion that you yourself have discarded, you feel an incredible impatience, a desire to want to help the person, bring them forward, show them the same kind of things that you saw, and hope that they don't waste the time on that idea that you wasted. Because I can see King Crocoduck as a really smart guy, and much of my frustration was more or less for his sake, a desire to save him from the same mistakes that I made, to save a lot of wasted time and effort. And again, once more, I know it sounds incredibly condescending to say that, to act like I have all the answers, to act like this is the way, I have the truth in my hands and I can just dispense it to him. And I acknowledge that. For all I know, King Crocoduck is thinking the exact same thing from my point of view. Maybe he looks at my view of the world and says, oh, I used to have this kind of cynical reactionary view of the world only 5 years back, and I was able to see the light and finally come to a renewed faith in liberalism and scientific technocracy to solve all of humanity's problems. And if he does feel that way, I certainly hope he makes a similar video to the one that I'm making now. But in lieu of the fact that I do feel that I was unjustly aggressive and probably did not give the conversation the time it deserved to truly explore the subjects that King Crocoduck was bringing up, I'm making this video now to kind of overview my thoughts on the matter, to review the things we talked about, our big differences, and perhaps put a finer point on why I turned my back on King Crocoduck's view of the world and came to the views that I hold now. I don't know if King Crocoduck will come across this video and watch it. If he does, I hope he enjoys it. This video is made in good faith as a good gesture to people like King Crocoduck and who have King Crocoduck's point of view on the world. Alright, so that being said, what is King Crocoduck's view of the world, and why do I have big problems with it? Well, in short, it's a form of liberal technocracy. It's a faith that through having sort of a rational dialectic, through having evidence-based conversations, humanity can really critically examine all of its facets and fix all of the problems in modern society. This is sort of a culmination of the Enlightenment perspective. It obviously has some origins in people like David Hume and other Enlightenment thinkers, perhaps later ones like Mill, but it finds its final culmination, or most recent culmination, in Karl Popper, who was a thinker that King Crocoduck himself mentioned over the course of our conversation. Popper wrote a quite famous book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he overviewed this view of a totally free discourse where people would examine social problems in a complete marketplace of ideas, and through the application of reason and critical analysis, we would come to the best possible solutions to the problems we faced as a human race. And the book's well written. I recommend it for anyone who's looking for more or less a summary on this point of view. And I've talked to a lot of people who are very sympathetic to this perspective on solving humanity's problems. Indeed, I would argue that, for the most part, this perspective is incredibly common among thinkers in Silicon Valley and other progressive epicenters of thought. These are the kind of assumptions that underlie most TED Talks, and that find their way into most of your basic communication courses in college. And I agree, it's very tempting, especially for people like myself who have dedicated a fair amount of their time to facilitating rational conversations in the public square. I mean, I certainly consider this channel to be an attempt to facilitate cordial and rational conversations about ideas in the public square. And so it's very tempting to believe that every problem in our society could sort of be boiled down to a highly rationalistic, evidence-based conversation. And we could use these kinds of discourses to guide human development. And we really wouldn't have to rely on anything as primitive as identity or tradition or higher order beliefs in metaphysical concepts or religions. But as you might have guessed, as tempting as this belief is, I don't think it's well warranted. In fact, interestingly enough, just as I was talking about this issue of having these rational discourses that will guide society with King Crocoduck, I had just a week earlier had a very similar conversation with Sargon of Akkad. And just like King Crocoduck, I mean, they're both liberals, Sargon really had fastened on this idea of the conversation itself being the way to reestablish liberalism and to really confront all human problems. We'd have this fundamentally rational discourse, perhaps with referees to ensure no deception was in play, and because the institution and the customs were so focused on making sure proper evidence was available, making sure that people were talking rationally and reasonably, of course the truth would eventually out, and humanity would come away with a better understanding of the universe, nay, the best understanding of the universe they possibly could have. And sure enough, Sargon and King Crocoduck thought that this kind of conversation could be used, or should be used, or might be used, not just to analyze current events, but perhaps even to analyze our own traditions, our own civilizational assumptions, our own metaphysical presuppositions about how the universe works, what's good and what's bad, and what is ultimately valuable. Now, in the case of Sargon, I'm not so sure his views are as well developed as Popper's or even as King Crocoduck's, but I got the sense when he talked about objectivist ethics and objectivist modes of discourse, he really believed that we could resurrect individualistic values and liberal values from the ground up, from just this competition of rational and evidence-based ideas. And I need to be entirely fair to these people because it was just a short while that I myself was the firmest believer in just that. That we could just take apart every human object, every human belief, and analyze it. And if it didn't measure up to the scrutiny we applied through our analysis, we would just take that belief and toss it in the trash. And that's essentially what we do with a lot of areas of science, and science is confident. It's certainly more reliable than anything like philosophy or sociology or any other field of human examination that we struggle with when we're trying to make up policy concerning human affairs. why not just borrow a page from science? And, I could see this in King Crocoduck's own worldview. He talked about how we could physicalize or use a physical basis for things like sociology and anthropology. And it's so funny because I was thinking along very similar lines myself. Like I said, just a few years back, I had read things like the Sokol hoax. I had just gotten out of high school, and I was convinced that if we could just nail those sociologists who were using all of these loose Marxist terms, we could actually get knowledge of the kind that could lead to real social change, productive use of society's resources, and everything would kind of work itself out. So if I believed it so recently, why don't I believe it anymore? Is it because I got hit with a dum-dum laser and now have become a religiously fanatically blind papist? Well, that may have happened, but really my rejection of this sort of mythologized view of a rationalistic conversation where sort of scientific standards of evidence can be superimposed onto conversations about more esoteric and abstract and human topics has nothing to do with religion or any other realignment of worldview along a spiritual axis. It has everything to do with just looking at the questions that were being asked. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but perhaps if King Crocoduck is listening to this, he can hear me out and decide if I'm speaking any sense when I go over these objections. All right, so let's go over these objections. So the first one's just an honest examination of the types of questions we would really be asking when we're asking things about social science, and the types of social science that would actually influence policy decisions in the real world. And now I know I mentioned this briefly in multiple videos, and I mentioned it again when I was talking to King Crocoduck, but we are asking really difficult questions when it comes to forming social policy and cultural policy. Things like, how do sexual taboos influence family formation on an intergenerational scale? Or how do authority systems impact children's learning ability across 18 years of education? These questions are going to be answered with very, very, very low confidence. They're going to be answered with studies that have almost no ability to repeat themselves. Now, I know when I brought this up to King Crocoduck, he responded by saying, well, the current methods can't repeat themselves, but look, we have some repeatable results from evolutionary psychology. Well, okay, I could be wrong about this, but from my knowledge of evolutionary psychology and from what I've been able to find since that conversation, the repeatable results we've seen from evolutionary psychology have all been on much easier questions. Things like, evolutionary psychology predicts that this type of secondary sex characteristic will be preferred by men. And then we do psychological experiments that show that that trait is indeed preferred. And we can therefore use the theory to back up that idea of why it's preferred. But that's a small question. That's something that we can actually imagine a clinical test for, an experiment that has a positive and can be done in a double-blind way. The questions I asked where we would actually base policy around, as I just mentioned, much more complicated, and any attempt to answer that question in the abstract is going to have incredibly low confidence. So already we see that the analogy to physics just gets broken immediately. Okay, but why does this low confidence even matter? Of course, we could just modify it, say, okay, we'll just do it on balance. Whoever can show the most confidence that the result is right, they'll be the reigning orthodoxy, whoever has the best balance of evidence. But you see, that doesn't really work, because in a low confidence environment, these experiments might not be repeatable. So experts could end up believing massively divergent things about how these systems operate, and there really would be no control on it. Without repeatability, the ability to kind of create a scientific consensus goes right out the window. And without that scientific consensus, the idea that you can import the confidence of the physical sciences by saying we're going to physicalize anthropology and sociology really is, from my standpoint, a ridiculous endeavor. And of course, this lack of confidence leads to the second really big problem. And that's the problem of scientific fads. Now, I know when I mentioned this, King Crocoduck said, okay, fads are an abuse, they're a problem, we have to confront them. But I don't think there's a real understanding, or at least I suppose there's not a real understanding of why these fads occur in low confidence science to begin with. And the reason I believe why these fads so frequently occur in low confidence science is that in low confidence science like sociology, there needs to be the appearance that the field has overall that it's making progress, that people are building upon the thoughts of others, and that, when you publish a paper and you're a professor, you need to get it cited a lot. You need to show that you're somehow advancing human knowledge. If everyone's just all over the place, if we're still sort of trying to rehash the same questions that were being asked in Athens in 300 BC, sociology as a field, it doesn't look very scientific. It doesn't look like it's making any progress. It looks like it's just spinning its wheels. It's getting no traction. And that doesn't look good. That makes people think it's less valuable. That makes people want to fund it less. And of course, for the most part, people do want to fund sociology less than they want to fund computer science and physics and chemistry and bioengineering technology. And I'm sure people will use this as sort of like, the front page news, sociology isn't a real science, checkmate, right? Okay. But this problem of scientific fads, it persists even in fields that we might not expect there to be fads in. Even in things like medicine and in engineering, you get people pouring a lot of money into technologies that are real dead ends. I mean, just 12 years ago, everyone was talking about hydrogen fuel cells, and a lot of money was being poured in, but the technology didn't go anywhere, and most people I know in this field don't think that technology is going anywhere. So why did it get a lot of money? Well, there's a lot of interest generated, and if you're writing a grant and you see that there's a lot of money behind research in an area, you're going to write the grant in that direction, and there's sort of a snowball effect. And I think it's very ironic or fitting that the King Crocoduck himself is very focused on global warming as a problem and as an issue. Now, global warming is a subject. It's not my area of expertise, but it's something that I've read a lot about. And I've talked to a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum, and you usually get these really massively divergent opinions. Oh, it's a fraud. Oh, it's a crisis. We need to act now. And in reading the research and talking to the activists really on both the progressive and conservative side, I found in my own appraisal that both of the activist perspectives were bullshit. Global warming, or anthropogenically generated global warming, certainly wasn't a fraud when we have evidence that man has a significant impact on climate generally. And the foundational theory was fairly solid. But more interestingly, on the other side, a lot of the stark projections about catastrophe looming because of carbon addition into the atmosphere were enormous exaggerations of what was going on and what was even possible based on most of the research that was being generated. I mean, the amount of money and investment in order to solve the global warming problem, even hypothetically, these activists were asking for what amounted to trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of annual commitment from the first world and the third world. And that's an enormous sum of the global GDP. And the activists were asking that it be spent to solve a problem, or to attempt to solve a problem, since no one to this date has a really clear idea of how you do geoengineering, even if it is a proactive prevention of a geoengineering effect. The activists were asking that this be spent to solve a temperature rise that may have only been marginally larger than other temperature rises Earth had experienced. It didn't make any sense. I mean, the only way it did make sense, the only way that the expenditure of trillions of dollars made sense, was that there would be some kind of runaway snowball effect. And indeed, there is a possibility that the greenhouse effect would sort of snowball and become this metastasizing disaster that humanity could not stop once it fully became underway. But this was an outside chance. The activists were sort of employing a Pascal's wager type argument. It's better if we do something rather than nothing because the possibility of this disaster. But when you really look into it, I mean, there's a number of these possible disasters that could exist in the future. Astronomers might tell you of the possibility that Earth gets hit by a giant meteor or asteroid and an extinction level event could happen. There's a possibility that we'll have a global water shortage that could kill billions of people. And not to go too science fiction, there's always the outside chance that we'll have some kind of viral AI take over the world and destroy humanity. I mean, people have talked about this, including some very significant scientists. These are all metastasizing, uncontrollable disasters that have a very low probability of occurring but are very scary. Now, you may ask yourself why there aren't conferences to stop asteroids or to confront a global water crisis or to examine the development of AI in a way that could harm humans. And the reason why there aren't global conferences to dedicate trillions of dollars to these problems is politics, and in particular academic politics. In all these fields like astrophysics or water management or artificial intelligence development, the fears of these disasters is a minority view, and it's kept under wraps by the others in the field. You have a lot of people worried about it, but then you have a lot of cooler heads, and they have roughly equal power. They balance each other out. But the field of climate modeling really came along and was developed at a time where the politics was primary, and many of the key figures of the development of climate modeling were really on board with carbon emission-driven warming being a huge disaster for the human race. And quite early in the field's development, they were able to build a consensus and drive politically for that consensus to be recognized by a political movement, namely the environmental movement. Subsequently, most of that field's funding comes from the global warming fear. There are scientists in the field of meteorology and climate modeling. I think a lot of the catastrophic predictions are overblown. People like Richard Lindzen. But for the most part, these voices are kept down because it benefits the entire field. If the field did not have this concern, it would not get funding. And this sort of shows you why fads occur. Fads occur because fads are profitable. If you can create a huge commotion around a potential opportunity or a potential disaster, even if you have not a very solid ability to show that that disaster or payoff is ever going to happen, you can still inspire a lot of investment, a lot of research grants. And that's roughly where I think global warming is right now. It's roughly where I see a lot of fields like sociology. I mean, if the scientists were honest and they were walking around with unreplicable results, no consensus, and as you might expect with a lot of independent research, with that low level of confidence, all of the scientists in this field, in a field like anthropology, will be walking around saying very different things. It would be really hard to get a grant published for any kind of research, because the grant funders would be thinking to themselves, well, we could send this money to sociology and they'll publish a paper saying X, but then in 2 months, another paper will come out saying not X. And hence, because a consensus needs to be developed in order to give the illusion of progress and get funding, fads will naturally develop, even if they're incorrect. Now, I know probably a lot of people are saying something like, oh, Distributus, this doesn't actually unseat the point that Sargon and King Crocoduck were making. It's not about the confidence, it's not about the certainty that you're right, and it doesn't even matter if every now and again there are fads. Maybe there are fads in one direction or the other, and that's just part of the natural error that humans make. If we do what Karl Popper did and treat social management and the management of society and civilization as an experiment, these errors will balance out. We'll make a change, we'll be wrong every now and again, but we'll fix the change and everything will kind of balance. Accepting a fad every now and again is better than just admitting to total ignorance, isn't it? It's all about experimentation. As Karl Popper said, right? We will make one incremental change, see how it performs for a few years, and then if it doesn't work, we'll just tweak the knobs back a little bit, and since the change is very small, no harm, no foul. Direct observation. That's how science is done, and maybe that's how our government of the human race can be done more effectively. So as you might have guessed, there are some problems with this. Specifically, 3 problems with this. The first, and I think the most important problem with this, are just the stakes. The stakes of the questions we're asking and the changes we're proposing. So in the conversation I had with King Crocoduck, what came up immediately were the sexual taboos that governed family formation. Now, King Crocoduck admitted that the family was a fundamental unit of society, and Sargon admits this too. They both know that without families raising children, you're just not going to have the kind of upbringing you need to raise people who are individualists. Now, I mean, even that admission is a huge step forward for a lot of pure liberals. Every now and again, you come across libertarians who think, we could just raise people in orphanages and they'd come out the same way. But no, I appreciate that admission, but what it belies is an agreement between us, between me, Sargon, and King Crocoduck, that family formation and sexual taboos are, at some level, the fundamental pillars of society. If we knock those down, the whole thing comes down. They would agree with that for the family. And I think you'd also have to agree that sexual taboos, which were the primary way that society enforced family formation, going back more than 2,000 years, well into the Roman era, these sexual taboos were just the consistent way of managing family formation. And so when we're putting this idea on the chopping block and hauling it in front of some critical analysts and saying, okay, justify the last 3,000 years of sexual taboos, justify how we've essentially forced people to build families, it's less like we're in the supermarket deciding, which brand of toothpaste to buy and which brand would give us a wider smile. It's more like society is sticking a gun in its mouth and deciding whether it wants to pull the trigger or not. Sure, you could argue that every that every person sometime in his life might have a dark night of the soul where he actually thinks of killing himself, but if somebody every week as a routine has a critical examination of whether he should blow his brains out, he's probably not going to be alive for very long, because one of these weeks he's going to have a mistake and then that's all going to be over. When you drag the critical elements out, when you put on the chopping blocks the very thing your civilization needs to carry on, there's no margin for error. You can't afford being wrong. You're not going to get a second shot to decide if maybe it wasn't the best idea that you pulled the trigger when the gun was in your mouth. And there doesn't seem to be a recognition along a lot of liberals. Maybe Sargon would acknowledge this, and maybe even King Crocoduck would, but it didn't seem so in the conversation I had with him, that the kinds of things that we're really critically examining, in the early 20th century, these are just foundational principles that the civilization we're part of need to survive. And I think there's ample evidence that in many ways we're not surviving, but I'll get into this a little bit later. The second really big problem with the approach brought up by King Crocoduck is that when we really get down to it, nothing can survive absolute scrutiny. Now, this kind of gets to this thing that, anarchists say, and I think it's originally attributed to Noam Chomsky. It's a ridiculous notion. And, even during my libertarian phase, I kind of believed it. And that is, whenever we have an institution or some way of doing things, we have to come to it and say, you have to justify why this thing is the way it is. And if you can't, boom, it's gone. We get rid of it. Because if you can't justify its existence, then it's illegitimate power. It's the power of authority. It's a power of the past. And we no longer need to respect this. And indeed, if you were in some kind of scientific field, it might make sense to apply just this kind of standard to people who defend one given theory over another, or who defend some kind of legacy theory with no evidence to support it whatsoever. But there's a big problem when you use this standard to judge social structures, rules, ways of doing things inside a civilization. Because when it really comes down to it, most of the presuppositions we have, most of the ethical values we hold, most of the perspectives that our entire worldview as Westerners, as people who believe in liberalism, as people who come from Christian civilization, none of these things can survive a high level of scrutiny. Now, when I talked to King Crocoduck, he seemed very reticent to believe that the sexual taboos we had had prior to the 1960s were important in maintaining family formation. Now, I personally believe that there's ample evidence for this, and in some sense, that would count for evidence to defend family formation, or this means of family formation. But I'm sure if you put your standards high enough, you could reject that evidence. You could say, oh, that defense isn't sufficient to justify this institution. And even at a deeper level, I'm wondering if people like Sargon of Akkad and King Crocoduck would really embrace this notion when it came to something like freedom. Now, the concept of personal choice and freedom are just absolutely critical for the liberal worldview. You can't have liberalism without those things: freedom of choice, the autonomy of the individual. But anyone who's listened to Sam Harris, and I know most people like King Crocoduck and Sargon have listened to people like Sam Harris, the entire notion of free will, from a purely scientific perspective, at this point has become questionable. And of course, the questions about free will, they're not new, right? I mean, the doubt about free will goes way back to the Greeks. It was revivified by the Calvinists. We've had to deal with questions about whether free will is real for a long time. But what if instead of family formation on the chopping block, we just put liberty itself on the chopping block? I could bring 50 neuroscientists to the stand that say free will is just an illusion. It's a product of the brain chemistry and our misunderstanding of causality. And if that's a scientific fact that's taking root at that moment, boom, in that moment, I get rid of any normative concept of liberty, freedom, free will, choice, the ability to do what you want with your body. And we've just entered a new era of Western society where totalitarianism is the order of the day. That sounds like a ridiculous example, like it would never happen, but if you believe this whole, justify your beliefs, justify your values, otherwise, boom, they're gone, which in some sense King Crocoduck did subscribe to, that would be the natural consequences. And it seems already the death of liberalism, just from that perspective, is really clear. And again, in that one moment of skepticism, your entire society goes the way of the dinosaurs. And I know, maybe, King Crocoduck would say something like, well, maybe people would believe that free will was an illusion for a little bit, and then they'd recontextualize it in some way that would allow them to hold that free will was not just strictly contradictory to what we know about neuroscience, and maybe that would be the case. But, the whole idea that you're turning these knobs back and forth and can correct things very easily goes out the window if freedom of expression and freedom of thought themselves become questioned. What happens if you get rid of the concept of freedom one generation? Does the next generation then have the right or the ability to speak up and make the correction? Maybe they won't. And this brings me to sort of my third and final reason why this whole Popperian idea that you can kind of tweak things experimentally over generations just won't work. And that is that you can't really tweak things with a knob. A lot of changes are just impossible to reverse, and this is no more on display than what we've seen with the sexual revolution. I think Crocoduck admitted himself that at this point, the sexual revolution is functionally unreversible. But this gets rid of the entire idea that we can run society experimentally. How would we know whether the sexual revolution would be a failure or not? Someone says, oh, we should try sexual libertinism, and sure enough, we don't have sexual libertinism. It's not real sexual libertinism until sexual liberty is spread everywhere, and then once sexual liberty is spread everywhere, it's impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. If you can't reverse the conditions, the idea of experimentation is useless. But it's even worse than that, because the whole idea also of experimentation, it presupposes that we are dealing in time frames that humans can understand and deal with. A lot of these social changes, they take 60 years to manifest because they're intergenerational changes. The people who start the changes aren't even going to be the same ones to see the consequences. And therefore, the idea that the experiment can be done in a controlled environment is ridiculous. This kind of augments the notion, popular among reactionaries, that the incremental change we see in society, the quote-unquote progression, might actually be a degeneration. Technology is constantly improving, and so you make a change to society, and because technology is improving and you're getting more money, you're able to survive the change that would in other operating conditions be bad and harmful. So a society that's in a growth period can make all sorts of disastrous change to its social organization. And then finally, when the money stops coming, when the growth rate slows down, all hell breaks loose, and the civilization essentially finds itself in crisis, thus creating a sort of intergenerational oscillation that's impossible for anyone to manage. And so under that circumstance, the tweaking's just out the window. So I know I've been rambling for quite a bit, and this is probably fairly long for a quick take. And probably people will say, oh, Distributist, you're just repeating the same things you told King Crocoduck in your conversation with him. You're just repeating yourself. Obviously, you're very taken aback, you're being too aggressive, and it may seem like it. It may seem that I'm just being monomaniacally obsessed with drumming these points in over and over and over again. But I feel like I have to, and it's not because I'm aggressive or I have something against King Crocoduck. It actually is quite the opposite. It's frustrating to see someone as intelligent as King Crocoduck dealing with the very mistakes that I myself dealt with. And I feel more than anything else that for my listeners, for perhaps King Crocoduck's listeners, I just want you guys to get over this. I want to help you. I want you to see the problems that I'm seeing, because I hate to think about how much of my own time I wasted futilely imagining that some kind of conversation of ultimate rationalism or some kind of incremental societal experimentalism would be the ultimate solution to mankind's problems. It's, in my opinion, it's manifestly not. And I'd hope people will see this. I hope we can move forward, because there are solutions. There are ways that we could perhaps go forward more intelligently, but it's not going to be found. The solutions aren't going to be found in pretending that we can apply these naive policies to what we're facing today. In many ways, the things we are facing today are a product of this very naivete. And I want people, smart people like King Crocoduck, to cross this bridge as fast as possible. So I hope you enjoyed this long ramble, and have a wonderful evening.